The cathedral bells rang with solemn grandeur as Lady Genevieve Hartley stood at the altar in her ivory silk gown, her hand trembling in the Duke of Ashford's cold grasp. The congregation held its breath as the Archbishop raised his hand to begin the sacred vows. Then, from the shadowed gallery above, a cloaked figure descended the stone steps. The stranger's lips moved near the Duke's ear, and in that instant his face transformed from aristocratic composure to ashen horror. He released Genevieve's hand as though burned, his eyes wild with something between fury and desperation. What could possibly shatter a duke's resolve at the very moment of matrimony? If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Genevieve Hartley had been raised to be a duchess. From her earliest memories in the sprawling estate of Hartley Manor in Somerset, every lesson, every carefully measured word, every graceful movement had been cultivated with singular purpose. Her mother, the formidable Lady Constance Hartley, had orchestrated her daughter's life with the precision of a military campaign. At 23, Genevieve possessed the accomplishments expected of the finest English gentlewoman. She played the pianoforte with delicate skill, spoke flawless French, embroidered with artistic flair, and moved through a ballroom with the ethereal grace that turned heads throughout London society. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Genevieve harbored secret longings. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the household still slumbered, she would steal away to her father's library and devour books of natural philosophy and poetry. She dreamed not merely of advantageous marriage, but of partnership, of intellectual companionship, of a love that transcended the cold calculations of family alliance. Her romantic heart had nurtured these hopes through countless seasons, even as she dutifully accepted the path her parents had designed. That path led inexorably to Lucian Ashford, the 6th Duke of Ashford, whose lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest and whose estates encompassed vast holdings across 3 counties. The match had been arranged when Genevieve was 17, sealed by promises between her father and the late Duke in the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's. Lucian himself had been studying at Cambridge then, a distant figure she had encountered only at formal occasions where he exhibited the refined manners expected of his station. Now, 6 years later, the marriage contract was to be fulfilled. Genevieve had spent the season in London, where she and Lucian were paraded before society as the ideal couple. He was handsome in the aristocratic manner, with sharp features, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and grey eyes that seemed to assess everything with cool calculation. In public, he performed his role flawlessly, offering his arm with practiced gallantry, dancing with measured precision, conversing with sophisticated wit that impressed the matrons and dowagers. But in their private moments, those rare instances when propriety demanded some semblance of intimacy, Genevieve detected something troubling beneath his polished veneer. His compliments felt rehearsed, his attention distracted, his gaze frequently wandering to assess who might be observing them. When she attempted genuine conversation about literature or philosophy, his responses were dismissive, redirecting discussion to matters of property, political advancement, and social standing. He spoke of their future with the detachment of a man discussing a business transaction, emphasizing the advantages of combining the Hartley fortune with Ashford prestige. Still, Genevieve had persuaded herself that affection might develop after marriage. Surely, she reasoned, once they were truly acquainted, once the performance for society ended, they would discover genuine connection. Her mother assured her that romantic love was a frivolous notion, that respect and duty formed the foundation of successful aristocratic unions. Her father, preoccupied with financial concerns that Genevieve only vaguely understood, seemed relieved that his daughter would be secured in such an elevated position. The wedding preparations consumed the following months. Hartley Manor transformed into a hive of activity as seamstresses created Genevieve's trousseau, as menu planners designed elaborate wedding breakfast arrangements, as gardeners cultivated hothouse flowers for the December ceremony. The guest list exceeded 300 of England's most prominent families. Westminster Cathedral had been reserved, its soaring Gothic arches the perfect setting for a ducal wedding. Genevieve threw herself into the preparations, hoping that her involvement would make the union feel more real, more hers. She selected fabrics, approved menus, wrote invitations in her elegant script. Yet, with each passing week, a subtle dread grew within her heart, a whisper she could not entirely silence. It intensified during a garden party at Ashford House in Mayfair, when she discovered Lucian in heated, whispered conversation with her own cousin, Lady Charlotte Hartley. Charlotte, 2 years Genevieve's junior, possessed a vivacious beauty and calculating ambition that made her simultaneously charming and dangerous. She had spent the season attracting suitors with practiced skill, but none had offered the status she craved. When Genevieve approached, both Lucian and Charlotte separated swiftly, their expressions shifting to innocent pleasantry with unsettling speed. Charlotte laughed, a brittle sound, and declared she had merely been congratulating the Duke on his excellent choice. But Genevieve had glimpsed something in that moment, a familiarity, an intimacy that sent ice through her veins. She mentioned the incident to no one, dismissing it as pre-wedding nerves, as imagination inflamed by anxiety. After all, what could it possibly mean? Lucian was to become her husband in mere weeks. The contracts were signed, the settlements arranged, society eagerly anticipated the event. To voice suspicion would bring scandal upon her family, would destroy carefully constructed alliances, would mark her as hysterical and ungrateful. As November gave way to December, as the wedding day approached with inexorable momentum, Genevieve found herself standing at her bedroom window in Hartley Manor, watching winter mist roll across the Somerset hills. The landscape seemed desolate, the bare trees skeletal against grey skies. In 3 days she would wear the ivory silk gown that hung in her wardrobe, would walk down Westminster's aisle on her father's arm, would pledge her life to a man she was beginning to suspect she did not truly know at all. A knock interrupted her melancholy reverie. Her lady's maid entered, carrying correspondence that had arrived with the afternoon post. Among the formal notes of congratulation, one envelope stood out, thick cream paper sealed with unfamiliar wax, addressed simply to Lady Genevieve in an unknown hand. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded a single sheet that contained just 7 words. "All is not what it seems. Trust yourself." There was no signature, no indication of the sender's identity. Genevieve stared at the cryptic message until the words blurred, her heart hammering against her ribs. What did it mean? Who would send such a thing on the eve of her wedding? She nearly summoned her mother, nearly showed the strange note to someone who might explain it. But something, intuition perhaps, or that persistent whisper of dread, made her fold it carefully and conceal it in her writing desk instead. She would proceed as planned. She had no choice. Her family's future, her own honour, society's expectations, all demanded that she walk into Westminster Cathedral in 3 days and become the Duchess of Ashford, regardless of mysterious messages or unsettling intuitions about strangers in shadowed galleries. Westminster Cathedral stood magnificent in the December morning, its towers reaching toward heavy grey skies that threatened snow. London society had turned out in extraordinary numbers, filling the ancient pews with silk and velvet, with jewels that glittered in candlelight, with whispered speculation about the union of 2 of England's most prominent families. The Hartley wealth, combined with Ashford lineage, promised to create a dynasty of significant influence. Genevieve arrived in an ornate carriage accompanied by her father, Lord Edmund Hartley. She wore ivory silk that cascaded like water, Brussels lace that had been her grandmother's, and pearls that caught the dim winter light. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with orange blossoms, and her veil, gossamer thin, could not quite conceal the pallor of her complexion or the anxiety in her green eyes. As they processed up the aisle, faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from admiration to envy. She recognized dowagers who had championed the match, debutantes who had coveted the Duke's attention, gentlemen who assessed her with the calculating gaze of men evaluating property. Her mother sat in the front pew, posture rigid with satisfaction, believing her life's work was reaching triumphant culmination. Charlotte occupied a prominent position nearby, her blonde beauty set off by rose-colored silk, her smile fixed and brilliant. At the altar stood Lucian, resplendent in formal attire, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his bearing every inch the aristocratic duke. Beside him, his friend Viscount Ravenswood served as groomsman, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, robed in ceremonial vestments, prepared to officiate at this pinnacle of social occasions. As Genevieve reached the altar, Lucian turned to face her. For one moment their eyes met, and she searched his expression for some hint of warmth, some trace of genuine feeling. But his gaze was shuttered, distant, as though he looked through rather than at her. He took her hand, his fingers cold despite his gloves, and they turned together to face the Archbishop. The ceremony began with sonorous Latin phrases that echoed through the vaulted space. Genevieve's responses came automatically, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The Archbishop spoke of duty, of sacred bonds, of the union of families before God and witnesses. The congregation leaned forward, eager to witness the moment when Lady Genevieve Hartley would become the Duchess of Ashford. Then, as the Archbishop raised his hand to pronounce the words that would bind them in matrimony, a disturbance rippled through the assembly. A figure emerged from the shadowed gallery above, descending the stone steps with deliberate purpose. The figure wore a dark cloak, hood drawn low, moving with the confidence of someone who had every right to interrupt England's most anticipated wedding. Gasps erupted from the congregation. The Archbishop paused mid-phrase, his expression shifting from solemnity to confusion. Lucian's hand tightened painfully on Genevieve's fingers, and she felt him go rigid beside her. The cloaked figure crossed the chancel with measured steps, approaching the altar with unsettling calm. "Your Grace!" The stranger's voice was low, feminine, carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Before you proceed, there is something you must know." The woman pushed back her hood, revealing a striking face framed by auburn hair, features marked by both beauty and evident distress. She appeared perhaps 25, dressed in garments that suggested genteel poverty rather than abject destitution. Genevieve had never seen her before, yet there was something hauntingly familiar in her bearing, in the set of her jaw. Lucian released Genevieve's hand, as though it burned him. His face had transformed from aristocratic composure to ashen horror, his grey eyes wide with something between fury and panic. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice barely controlled. "How dare you? How dare I?" The woman's laugh was bitter. "How dare you proceed with this farce when you know the truth?" She turned to Genevieve, and her eyes held a mixture of pity and determination. "My lady, I am Eleanor Thorne. For the past 3 years I have been the Duke's mistress, residing in a house he maintains in Chelsea. That perhaps would not surprise you. Many aristocratic gentlemen maintain such arrangements, but there is more you should know before you bind yourself to this man." The cathedral erupted in shocked exclamations. Ladies reached for their vinaigrettes, gentlemen leaned forward with undisguised fascination, and the Archbishop looked between Lucian and Eleanor with growing alarm. Genevieve felt the world tilting, as though the ancient stone floor had become unstable beneath her feet. "Remove her," Lucian commanded, his voice sharp with desperation. "She is deranged, she—" "I am the mother of your son," Eleanor continued, her voice rising to carry through the chaos. "William Ashford Thorne, aged 2 years and 3 months, with his father's grey eyes and dark hair. He waits even now with his nurse in Chelsea while his father attempts to marry another woman without acknowledging his existence." Silence fell like a physical blow. Every eye fixed on Lucian, whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling before them. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to be calculating some response that might salvage the situation. But Eleanor was not finished. She produced from her cloak a bundle of letters tied with ribbon and held them aloft. "I have his correspondence, promising me marriage once certain financial arrangements were completed. I have witnesses to our 3-year relationship. I have our son's baptismal record, where the Duke attended and signed as the father. I remained silent as instructed, accepting my position, believing his promises. But when I learned he intended to marry Lady Genevieve, without even informing her of my existence, of his child's existence, I knew I could not let this travesty proceed." Charlotte had risen from her pew, her face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shock. But as Genevieve's gaze found her cousin, she saw something else flicker across those features. A calculation, an assessment of opportunity, even in crisis. Genevieve's mother had gone white, gripping the pew before her as though it were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Her father stood frozen, the financial implications clearly racing through his merchant's mind. The entire assembly watched, transfixed, as English aristocracy's carefully maintained facade shattered in the most public manner imaginable. "Is this true?" The Archbishop's voice cut through the mounting chaos, directed at Lucian with ecclesiastical authority. "Your Grace, is there a child?" Lucian's jaw worked silently. In that moment, Genevieve saw him truly for the first time, not the polished duke, not the sophisticated suitor, but a man whose arrogance and selfishness had constructed a web of deception that was now collapsing spectacularly upon him. He had gambled that Eleanor would remain silent, that his status would protect him, that he could secure the Hartley fortune through marriage while maintaining his secret life. "There may be circumstances," he began, but the words died as he met Genevieve's eyes. She stood at the altar in her grandmother's lace, before 300 witnesses, the object of the most scandalous spectacle London society had witnessed in decades. Humiliation washed over her in waves, not merely for herself, but for her family, for her mother's ambitions, for her father's financial hopes. She had been a transaction, a means to an end, never a partner or beloved. The romantic dreams she had nurtured seemed pathetically naive now, the fantasies of a foolish girl who had mistaken calculated courtship for genuine affection. The whispers began to build, a crescendo of scandal that would echo through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs for months, perhaps years. Lady Genevieve Hartley jilted at the altar, the Duke of Ashford exposed as a deceiver, the mysterious mistress and illegitimate child. It was the stuff of penny novels, except this was her life, unraveling in real time before society's avid gaze. Genevieve felt her legs threaten to buckle. The cathedral, so magnificent moments before, now seemed like a prison of stone and stained glass, trapping her in the most mortifying moment of her existence. She needed to escape, to flee from the staring faces and whispered speculation, from Lucian's stricken expression and Eleanor's pitying gaze, from the wreckage of everything she had been raised to become. With trembling hands, she lifted her heavy skirts and turned from the altar. Her father reached for her arm, but she evaded his grasp, walking back down the aisle with as much dignity as she could summon. The congregation parted before her, faces blurring through the tears that now streamed unchecked down her cheeks. Behind her she could hear Lucian calling her name, hear Eleanor's voice raised in further accusation, hear the Archbishop attempting to restore order to ecclesiastical chaos. But Genevieve kept walking, past the gaping nobles and scandalized matrons, past Charlotte, whose expression had transformed into something dangerously triumphant, past everything that had defined her existence. She burst through the cathedral doors into December cold, into grey London daylight, gasping for air as though she had been drowning. Her mother's carriage waited at the curb, and she climbed inside without instruction to the driver, pulling the door shut behind her. Only then, in the velvet-lined privacy, did she allow the full weight of humiliation to crash over her. She had stood before the altar ready to pledge her life, and discovered she had been nothing more than a financial convenience to a man who maintained a mistress and child in secret. The golden cage she had inhabited since birth had revealed itself as gilded in illusion rather than reality, and she had no idea who she was supposed to become in the wreckage left behind. The scandal reverberated through London with the force of an earthquake. By evening, every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with variations of the tale, each retelling more embellished than the last. Some accounts had Eleanor producing not one, but 3 illegitimate children at the altar. Others claimed Genevieve had fainted dramatically, or that Lucian had attempted to physically remove his former mistress from the cathedral. The Morning Chronicle would print a carefully worded account that managed to convey maximum scandal while observing minimum propriety. And by week's end, satirical cartoons would appear in shop windows depicting the Duke torn between 2 women, while bishops looked on in horror. For Genevieve, sequestered in Hartley House's upstairs chambers, the immediate aftermath passed in a haze of shock and shame. Her mother alternated between fury at Lucian's deception and despair at their social ruin. Her father closeted himself with solicitors, attempting to salvage financial arrangements and determine if breach of promise suits might recover some dignity. Callers arrived incessantly, some offering genuine sympathy, most fishing for details to fuel further gossip. On the 3rd day, salvation arrived in the unlikely form of Aunt Agatha Pemberton, her father's elder sister. Agatha was a widow of independent means, who had scandalized the family 20 years prior by refusing remarriage and instead establishing herself in a fashionable townhouse in Bath. She arrived at Hartley House like a brisk winter wind, sweeping past the butler with barely a pause, her travelling cloak still swirling about her practical woolen dress. "Where is my niece?" she demanded, finding Genevieve's mother in the drawing-room, surrounded by tea-things and tear-stained handkerchiefs. "I've come to collect her." Lady Constance looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Agatha, this is hardly the time for one of your unconventional—" "It is precisely the time," Agatha interrupted, her sharp grey eyes missing nothing. "The girl is suffocating here. Surrounded by recriminations and social wreckage, she needs distance, perspective, and a place where she can remember she's more than this disaster." "Where would you take her?" Lord Edmund emerged from his study, looking haggard from sleepless nights and financial calculations. "To Bath, naturally. To my home, where she can breathe without London's suffocating gossip, where she can decide what she wishes to become, rather than what society dictates she must be." Agatha's voice gentled slightly. "Edmund, Constance, I know this is catastrophic by your measure, but your daughter is young, intelligent, and remarkably resilient. This is not an ending. It could be the beginning of something far better than a marriage to a duplicitous duke ever would have been." The suggestion met initial resistance, but Agatha was formidable when determined. Within 2 days, arrangements were made. Genevieve would retreat to Bath for the winter, away from London's scrutiny, where she might recover her equilibrium. Her mother insisted on strict mourning-like seclusion, but Agatha firmly rejected such melodrama. The journey to Bath took the better part of a day, Genevieve wrapped in travelling furs and buried in her own thoughts as the carriage rolled through winter countryside. Agatha, mercifully, did not press for conversation, allowing her niece the space to process the catastrophe that had upended her existence. Bath, when they arrived as twilight fell, appeared almost magical in the winter dusk. The honey-coloured Georgian buildings glowed in lamplight, the curved crescents and elegant squares suggesting a world far removed from London's rigid social hierarchies. Agatha's townhouse stood in the Royal Crescent, a beautifully proportioned residence that somehow managed to be both fashionable and comfortable. "This will be your home for as long as you need it," Agatha declared as they entered. "My only rule is this. You are not to hide away as though you've done something shameful. You are the wronged party in this affair, Genevieve. Remember that." Over the following weeks, Agatha proved herself an extraordinary mentor. Unlike Genevieve's mother, who had raised her daughter to be ornamental, Agatha believed in substance. She introduced Genevieve to Bath's intellectual circles, not merely the fashionable spa society, but the writers, artists and reformers who gathered in the city's more progressive salons. It was at one such gathering, a literary evening hosted by Mrs. Adelaide Winthrop in her Lansdowne Crescent home, that Genevieve first encountered a world where her intelligence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The assembled guests discussed Mary Wollstonecraft's writings, debated the merits of Wordsworth's latest poetry, and argued passionately about parliamentary reform. For the first time in her life, Genevieve ventured opinions and found them received with genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. "You have remarkable insight," observed a gentleman seated across from her, his voice warm with what seemed like authentic appreciation rather than empty flattery. "Your analysis of Keats's imagery suggests substantial literary study." Genevieve looked up to meet intelligent dark eyes set in a handsome face, weathered by experience rather than youth. The gentleman appeared perhaps 35, dressed with understated elegance, his bearing suggesting education and breeding without aristocratic pretension. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Julian Hadley," Mrs. Winthrop interjected, "recently returned from medical study in Edinburgh, and newly established in practice here in Bath. Dr. Hadley, this is Lady Genevieve Hartley, niece to our dear Mrs. Pemberton." Recognition flickered in Dr. Hadley's eyes. He clearly knew of the scandal, but his expression remained respectfully neutral. "A pleasure, Lady Genevieve. I hope Bath is proving restorative." "It is," she replied carefully, uncertain how to engage with a man who acknowledged her recent humiliation without either prurient curiosity or excessive pity. Over subsequent weeks, Genevieve found herself repeatedly in Dr. Hadley's company at various gatherings. He was, she learned, something of an outsider himself, the younger son of a minor baronet who had eschewed the church or military for medical science. His time in Edinburgh had exposed him to progressive ideas about public health and social reform, and he had returned to Bath intending to establish a practice that served not merely wealthy invalids, but the city's working poor as well. His conversation was unlike anything Genevieve had experienced among London's aristocratic gentlemen. He spoke passionately about cholera prevention, about the need for clean water and proper sanitation, about educational reform and the expansion of medical knowledge. He quoted philosophy and poetry with equal facility, challenged her perspectives without condescension, and listened to her opinions as though they mattered. "You're wasted as mere ornament," he remarked one evening as they walked through Bath's elegant gardens, Agatha trailing at a discreet distance as chaperone. "You have a mind that deserves engagement, Lady Genevieve. What do you wish to do with your life, beyond the marriage market that treated you so abominably?" The question stopped her. No one had ever asked what she wished. Her life had been a predetermined path, from cradle toward an advantageous union, and even that ambition had now been spectacularly destroyed. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been permitted to consider the question." "Then perhaps this catastrophe, as painful as it was, has granted you an unexpected gift," Dr. Hadley suggested, "the freedom to choose." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. Agatha, observing her niece's increasing animation in Dr. Hadley's presence, approved wholeheartedly. "He's a good man," she told Genevieve, "intelligent, principled, and genuinely accomplished rather than merely titled. Your mother would have an apoplectic fit, of course. A doctor is terribly beneath a future duchess. But you're not going to be a duchess now, are you? So you might as well consider what would actually make you happy." Genevieve found herself doing precisely that. She began accompanying Dr. Hadley on his charitable rounds, assisting with patient records and learning basic nursing skills. She discovered a passion for the work, for the tangible good it accomplished, for the gratitude in patients' eyes when their suffering was alleviated. This was purpose beyond social performance, contribution beyond advantageous marriage. Meanwhile, news from London continued to filter through correspondence. The scandal had indeed ruined the Duke's reputation. Eleanor Thorne's revelations had led to further investigations that uncovered not merely one illegitimate child, but a pattern of financial impropriety in his estate management. Lucian had retreated to his country seat in disgrace. Charlotte, opportunistically, had captured the attention of a wealthy industrialist and seemed positioned to secure an advantageous match of her own. Genevieve felt surprisingly little when reading these updates. The humiliation had faded, replaced by something unexpected: gratitude. That catastrophic moment at Westminster's altar had shattered a golden cage, had revealed a path she never would have discovered otherwise. She was learning who she might become when freed from society's predetermined scripts. One evening in late February, as winter began its gradual retreat, Dr. Hadley requested a private audience with both Genevieve and Agatha. They received him in the townhouse's elegant drawing room, and Genevieve felt her heart accelerate as he stood before them with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Lady Genevieve," he began, then stopped, gathering courage. "I recognize the impropriety of what I'm about to propose. You've barely had time to recover from one disastrous near marriage, and I have no right to thrust another proposal upon you so soon. But I must speak honestly because I've come to... That is, I hold you in the highest regard." Genevieve felt Agatha's encouraging touch on her shoulder as Dr. Hadley continued, "I cannot offer you a dukedom or vast estates. My income is modest by your family's standards, my work frequently unpleasant and demanding. But I can offer genuine partnership, intellectual companionship, and a shared purpose that extends beyond social performance. I've fallen in love with your mind as much as your beauty, with your kindness as much as your breeding. If you could conceive of a life quite different from what you were raised to expect, a life in service rather than display, of meaningful work rather than fashionable idleness, then I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." The proposal hung in the air, so entirely different from Lucian's calculated courtship that Genevieve almost laughed at the contrast. This was not strategic alliance but genuine affection, not transaction but invitation to partnership. Dr. Hadley watched her with open vulnerability, risking rejection without the aristocratic armor that had made Lucian simultaneously charming and cold. "I would like some time to consider," Genevieve replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not because I doubt your sincerity, but because I wish to be certain of my own heart. The last time I agreed to marriage, I was fulfilling others' expectations. This time, if I accept, it must be entirely my own choice." Dr. Hadley's expression reflected both disappointment and respect. "Of course. Take whatever time you need, Lady Genevieve. My feelings will remain constant." After he departed, Agatha turned to her niece with barely suppressed delight. "Well, what are you thinking?" Genevieve moved to the window, looking out over Bath's lamplit streets, processing the extraordinary transformation of the past months. 4 months ago she had stood at Westminster's altar, prepared to marry a duke out of duty and vague romantic hope. Now she was considering a physician's proposal, drawn not by title or fortune, but by genuine admiration and shared values. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that being jilted at the altar might be the best thing that ever happened to me. And that Dr. Julian Hadley might offer everything I actually need, even if it's nothing like what I was taught to want." Agatha's smile was brilliant. "Then, my dear girl, I believe you're finally learning to live." Spring arrived in Bath with spectacular displays of blooming gardens and renewed social activity. The waters drew visitors from across England, and the city's ballrooms and assembly rooms reopened for the season with fresh energy. Genevieve, who had spent the winter in relative seclusion punctuated by intellectual gatherings, found herself tentatively re-entering society under Agatha's guidance. But she returned transformed. No longer the dutiful ornament of her London debut, Genevieve now possessed a quiet confidence, born from months of purposeful work and genuine intellectual engagement. She had accepted Dr. Hadley's proposal 3 weeks after it was offered, and though they planned a modest ceremony for summer, the news had already begun circulating through Bath's social networks. "You're the talk of the pump room," Agatha reported with amusement. "Lady Genevieve Hartley, nearly Duchess of Ashford, now choosing to marry a physician. Half of Bath thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half finds it the most romantically bold decision in years." Genevieve smiled, arranging flowers in her aunt's drawing room. "And which half do you belong to?" "The half that believes you've finally found your spine and your purpose," Agatha replied. "Now, we've been invited to Lady Pemberton's ball tomorrow evening." "Yes, another Lady Pemberton. No relation, unfortunately. It's the most significant event of Bath's spring season, and I think it's time you made a proper appearance as Dr. Hadley's intended, rather than as Scandal's refugee." The prospect of such public exhibition still caused Genevieve anxiety, but she recognized Agatha's wisdom. She could not hide indefinitely, and entering society as chosen fiancée rather than rejected bride would help rewrite the narrative that had defined her since December. Dr. Hadley, Julian as she now called him in private, arrived to escort them the following evening. He looked distinguished in formal attire, his bearing reflecting the natural confidence of a man secure in his accomplishments rather than dependent on inherited title. As he handed Genevieve into the carriage, his expression held both pride and protective concern. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," he murmured. "If it becomes overwhelming, we can depart immediately." "I know," she replied, squeezing his hand, "but I want to do this. I want to step forward as your future wife, as someone who chose her own path." Lady Pemberton's residence in Brock Street blazed with light and music. The assembly rooms beyond were filled with Bath's spring society, wealthy invalids taking the waters, fashionable visitors escaping London before the season began, and local families of consequence. As Genevieve entered on Julian's arm with Agatha sweeping before them, conversations paused, fans fluttered, and assessment rippled through the gathering. Then Lady Pemberton herself, a formidable matron of considerable social standing, approached with outstretched hands. "Lady Genevieve, Dr. Hadley, I'm absolutely delighted you could attend. My dear, you look absolutely radiant. Bath air agrees with you clearly." The hostess's warm welcome set the tone. Other guests approached, offering congratulations on her engagement with varying degrees of sincerity. Genevieve navigated the social labyrinth with new perspective, recognizing which compliments were genuine and which concealed prurient curiosity about her scandal. She was engaged in conversation with Mrs. Winthrop and several literary ladies when a footman approached with a note on a silver salver. Genevieve unfolded it to find a message in elegant script. "I would speak with you in the garden gallery. Matters of mutual concern. See Charlotte." Her cousin was in Bath. Genevieve's first instinct was to ignore the summons, but curiosity, and perhaps a desire to face this final ghost from her former life, compelled her. She excused herself, informing Julian quietly of her destination. He frowned, but nodded, positioning himself where he could observe the gallery entrance. The garden gallery was a glassed enclosure where Lady Pemberton cultivated exotic plants. Lamplight filtered through the foliage, creating dramatic shadows. Charlotte waited near a spectacular orchid display, dressed in emerald silk that set off her blonde beauty. But up close, Genevieve detected tension in her cousin's posture, a brittleness in her smile. "Genevieve, you look well, remarkably well considering." Charlotte's tone carried barbs wrapped in silk. "Thank you, Charlotte. I am well. What did you wish to discuss?" Charlotte circled closer, her eyes assessing. "I wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true, that you're actually going to marry a physician, a younger son with barely adequate income, when you could have been a duchess." "I was nearly a duchess," Genevieve replied calmly, "and discovered that coronets and estates mean nothing without honesty and genuine regard. Julian offers me partnership, Charlotte, something I suspect you wouldn't understand." Charlotte's expression hardened. How gratifyingly noble. Tell me, did it ever occur to you that your scandal affected others beyond yourself? Your family's reputation was damaged. My own prospects were compromised by association. And yet I understand you're to marry Mr. Bartholomew Ashton, the railway magnate. Hardly a compromise. He's one of England's wealthiest men. He's in trade, Charlotte snapped, the snobbery revealing itself. I was courted by earls, Genevieve. Real aristocracy. But after your spectacular debacle, they questioned the Hartley family's judgment, our stability. I had to settle for new money. Genevieve studied her cousin, seeing clearly now what she had only suspected before. You knew, didn't you, about Eleanor Thorne and Lucian's child. That's why you looked so calculating at the cathedral when it all emerged. You knew before the wedding. Charlotte's silence was confirmation enough. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment genuine emotion flickered across her features, resentment, ambition, and something like envy. Did you tell her? Genevieve pressed. Did you inform Eleanor about the wedding date? Perhaps suggest that exposing the Duke at the altar would serve both your interests. She would escape her degrading position, and you would be free from association with my impending ducal marriage, able to pursue your own ambitions without being forever relegated to lesser cousin status. You have no proof of that. But Charlotte's voice lacked conviction. I don't need proof. I can see the truth in your face. You orchestrated that humiliation, Charlotte. Perhaps not the scandal itself. Lucian's deceptions were his own, but certainly its timing, its spectacular public nature. Genevieve felt surprisingly calm, stating facts rather than accusations. You wanted me brought low. I wanted what was fair, Charlotte's composure cracked. You were always the favored one, the beauty, the accomplished daughter. Your mother paraded you before the highest echelons while mine, your father's younger brother, struggled with lesser income and diminishing prospects. You were raised for a dukedom while I was expected to settle for baronets or wealthy merchants. So yes, when I discovered Lucian's secret during a house party where his careful facade slipped, I saw opportunity. I contacted Eleanor. I suggested she had a right to object publicly rather than suffer in obscurity. I didn't create the scandal, Genevieve. I merely redirected it for maximum impact. The admission hung between them, damning and oddly liberating. Genevieve had suspected much of this, but hearing it confirmed brought clarity. You should despise me, Charlotte added, her voice now bitter rather than triumphant. You should rage, threaten exposure, demand I be cut from family gatherings. I should, Genevieve agreed, but instead I find I'm grateful. Your manipulations destroyed an illusion, Charlotte. You revealed Lucian's true character before I was legally bound to him. Yes, the humiliation was extraordinary, but the alternative, discovering his deceptions years into marriage, trapped by law and social convention, would have been worse. So in your attempt to destroy me, you actually freed me. And now I'm engaged to a man of genuine worth, pursuing work that matters, and genuinely happy in ways I never was in London. Charlotte stared, clearly unprepared for this response. She had anticipated fury, perhaps threats. Instead, she faced a woman who had transformed humiliation into liberation. Before either could speak further, the gallery door opened. Julian entered, his expression alert but calm. Forgive the intrusion, but Lady Genevieve, you're wanted for the next dance. That is, if you're finished with your conversation. He directed the question at Genevieve, while positioning himself between her and Charlotte in a subtly protective gesture that spoke volumes about his character. He would not presume to fight her battles, but he stood ready to support however she needed. We're quite finished, Genevieve confirmed, moving to Julian's side. She paused at the threshold, looking back at her cousin. I hope Mr. Ashton makes you happy, Charlotte. I hope you find what you're seeking. But I suspect you'll discover that manipulating others toward your goals leaves you ultimately hollow. Genuine happiness comes from building something real, not from tearing others down. As they returned to the ballroom, Julian's hand warm and steady at the small of her back, Genevieve felt the final weight of her scandal lift. Let Charlotte scheme and calculate. Let London gossip. She had found something infinitely more valuable than social standing. She had found purpose, partnership, and her own voice. The remainder of the evening passed in a warm blur. She danced with Julian, whose skill was respectable if not spectacular, and found she preferred his honest enjoyment to the calculated performances of London ballrooms. She conversed with Bath's intellectual set, discussing medical advances and social reforms with genuine engagement. And when elderly Lord Thornbury, one of Bath's most respected residents, publicly congratulated her on choosing genuine worth over empty title, she felt vindicated in ways society pages could never accomplish. As the ball concluded and they prepared to depart, Julian drew her aside in a quiet corner. "I watched you in the gallery with your cousin. You were magnificent, calm, dignified, entirely in command. The woman who walked down Westminster's aisle in humiliation has become someone quite remarkable." Genevieve smiled, the last vestiges of shame finally dissolving. "That's because I'm no longer trying to be who others expect. I'm discovering who I actually am. And Julian, I'm choosing you this life with absolute certainty. Not because other options failed, but because this is what I genuinely want." His kiss, decorous but tender in the shadowed alcove, sealed the promise between them. Outside, spring rain had begun to fall, washing Bath's honeystones clean, and Genevieve felt as though nature itself was marking new beginnings. She had entered this city broken and humiliated. She would leave it in a few months' time, as Dr. Julian Hadley's wife prepared for a life of purpose and genuine partnership. The golden cage was gone. In its place stood open doors, and she was ready to walk through them on her own terms. News of Genevieve's engagement to Dr. Julian Hadley spread through English society with predictable reactions. The conservative elements viewed it as confirmation of scandal's corrupting influence. A young lady of quality, having failed to secure appropriate aristocratic marriage, settling for a professional man barely above the merchant class. The more progressive circles saw it as refreshingly romantic, a woman choosing genuine affection over mercenary alliance. Genevieve's mother, upon receiving the announcement, had taken to her bed for 3 days with severe palpitations that required medical attendance. Her father, more pragmatic, had demanded a meeting with Julian to assess the match's practical implications. That interview, conducted at Hartley House with appropriate gravity, had resulted in grudging respect if not enthusiasm. Julian's medical credentials were unimpeachable, his family connections respectable if modest, and his prospects solid if unspectacular. Most importantly, he demonstrated genuine regard for Genevieve that even her disappointed father could not dismiss. "You understand you're throwing away every advantage your birth provided," Lord Edmund said bluntly during a private conversation with his daughter in late April, when she had travelled to London to finalise wedding arrangements. "You were raised to move in the highest circles, Genevieve. A physician's wife, regardless of his personal merit, will never access those spheres." "I understand, Father," Genevieve replied, standing at the window of her childhood bedroom, looking out over the Mayfair streets, where she had once imagined her future. "But those spheres nearly destroyed me. The highest circles value appearance over substance, connection over character. Julian offers me something more valuable, a partnership where my thoughts matter as much as my accomplishments, where I can contribute meaningfully rather than merely ornament society events." Her father sighed, the sound heavy with parental concern and social conditioning. "You've changed. That incident at Westminster changed you fundamentally." "It freed me," she corrected gently. "It showed me that the path I was following would have led to profound unhappiness. Yes, the humiliation was terrible, but Father, if I had married Lucian, discovered his deceptions afterward when I was legally and socially bound to him, when perhaps children were involved, wouldn't that have been worse?" He had no answer to that. and his eventual blessing, while not enthusiastic, carried genuine hope that she knew her own heart. The confrontation with Lucian himself came unexpectedly during her London visit. She was walking through Hyde Park with Julian, enjoying unseasonably warm April sunshine, when a familiar figure appeared on the path ahead. The Duke of Ashford, looking significantly less polished than she remembered, his attire correct but somehow diminished, his bearing no longer radiating aristocratic confidence. He stopped when he saw them, and for a moment the three stood frozen in a tableau that recalled their catastrophic near union. Then Lucian removed his hat, offering a stiff bow. "Lady Genevieve, Dr. Hadley." His voice held none of its former smoothness, instead sounding strained and uncertain. Julian's hand tightened protectively on Genevieve's arm, but she signaled her composure. She could face this ghost without fear. "Your Grace," she acknowledged coolly. "I trust you are well." "I am managing." Lucian's grey eyes, which she had once thought sophisticated, now appeared simply tired. "I owe you an apology, Lady Genevieve. What occurred at Westminster was unconscionable. I behaved abominably, prioritizing financial considerations and social advancement over basic honesty. You deserved far better." The apology, unexpected as it was, carried the ring of genuine regret rather than social performance. Genevieve studied the man who had nearly become her husband, seeing him with clear eyes. Without the aristocratic armor, he appeared almost pitiable, a man whose arrogance and deception had cost him more than he had anticipated. "What happened to Eleanor Thorne?" she asked. "And your son?" Lucian's expression twisted with something between shame and resignation. "I've acknowledged William formally, established a proper trust for his upbringing and education. Eleanor, we attempted reconciliation, but too much damage had been done. She's remarried now to a widowed solicitor who treats both her and William with genuine affection. They seem happy, happier than I could have made them, certainly. And you?" Julian's question was direct but not unkind, physician's curiosity rather than social interrogation. "I'm learning that titles and estates mean little when one's character is bankrupt," Lucian admitted, with bitter self-awareness. "Society tolerates aristocratic peccadillos, but public exposure of the type I experienced leaves lasting stains. I'm largely ostracized from the circles I once navigated effortlessly. My mother is deeply disappointed. My estates require attention I've neglected for years in favor of pleasures and self-indulgence. I'm discovering, rather late, what actually matters." Genevieve felt an unexpected stirring of compassion. She would never forgive the humiliation he had caused, but she could recognize a man genuinely confronting his failures. "I hope you find your way to something better, Your Grace, for your son's sake, if nothing else." "I hear congratulations are in order," Lucian said, glancing at Julian. "Dr. Hadley, you're a fortunate man. I was too arrogant to recognize Lady Genevieve's true worth. I hope you prove wiser." "Oh, I intend to spend my life being worthy of her," Julian replied simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice made Lucian wince, a reminder of what genuine devotion sounded like, contrasted with his own calculating courtship. They parted shortly after, Lucian disappearing into Hyde Park's winding paths, a diminished figure carrying the weight of consequences. As Genevieve watched him go, she felt the final vestiges of hurt dissolve. He had been a necessary catastrophe, the destruction that preceded reconstruction. She bore him no affection, but neither did she carry hatred. He was simply a man who had made terrible choices and was now living with their aftermath. "Are you well?" Julian asked quietly, his concern evident. "I am," she replied truthfully. Seeing him like that, diminished, genuinely regretful, it closes something that needed closing. He's no longer the Duke who humiliated me at the altar. He's just a flawed man who made mistakes. And I'm no longer the shattered girl who fled Westminster in tears. We've both moved on. The wedding preparations proceeded through May with refreshing simplicity. Rather than the Westminster extravaganza that had ended in disaster, Genevieve and Julian planned a modest ceremony in Bath's elegant abbey, with just family and close friends in attendance. Agatha threw herself into arrangements with delighted efficiency, ensuring every detail reflected the couple's genuine preferences rather than social expectations. Genevieve's wedding gown, when completed, was lovely but understated. Ivory silk, without excessive embellishment, practical rather than theatrical. She would wear no veil this time, no need to obscure her face. This marriage was something she entered clear-eyed and certain. The night before the ceremony, as she sat in Agatha's drawing room with her aunt and a few close friends, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from that catastrophic December morning to this peaceful May evening. She had been raised to be a duchess, trained for a role in society's highest echelons. Instead, she would become a physician's wife, working alongside her husband in his practice, contributing to Bath's charitable medical initiatives, living a life of service rather than display. "Any regrets?" Agatha asked, pouring sherry for the small gathering. Genevieve considered the question seriously. "None. Not even the humiliation at Westminster, because it led me here. If that morning had proceeded as planned, I would have married Lucian, discovered his deceptions gradually, and spent years trapped in a loveless union of social convenience. Instead, Eleanor's intervention freed me to discover who I actually am and what genuinely matters. So no, Aunt Agatha, no regrets at all. Then you're wiser than most twice your age," Agatha declared, raising her glass, to Lady Genevieve Hartley, soon to be Mrs. Julian Hadley, a woman who transformed scandal into liberation and chose authentic life over gilded cage. "May your marriage be everything you deserve." The toast was echoed around the room, and as Genevieve sipped her sherry, she felt profound gratitude for the circuitous path that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow she would walk down Bath Abbey's aisle on her father's arm, but this time toward a partner she had chosen with full knowledge and genuine affection. This time there would be no mysterious strangers with devastating revelations, no last-minute catastrophes. Just two people committing to building a life together, grounded in mutual respect, shared purpose, and authentic love. As the evening concluded and guests departed, Genevieve stood at the window of her temporary home, looking out over Bath's lamplit streets. Tomorrow would mark the end of her identity as Lady Genevieve Hartley, scandalous figure of London gossip, and the beginning of her life as Mrs. Julian Hadley, partner to a man of principle, contributor to meaningful work, and finally, gloriously, herself. The May night was soft and warm, carrying the scent of blooming gardens through the open window. In the distance, she could hear Bath Abbey's bells, marking the late hour, the same bells that would ring tomorrow to celebrate her marriage. And for the first time since that catastrophic December morning, Genevieve felt completely at peace with her future. Not because it promised title or prestige, but because it promised truth, partnership, and the freedom to become whoever she chose to be. 18 months after the Westminster scandal that had defined and then freed her, Genevieve stood in the light-filled consulting room of the Hadley medical practice in Bath's working-class Avon Street district. The late September morning sun streamed through tall windows as she updated patient records in the ledger, her handwriting neat and efficient after months of practice. The modest building housed both Julian's medical practice on the ground floor and their private apartments above, a far cry from the grand estates she had once been destined to inhabit, but infinitely more satisfying. She wore a practical dark blue dress with minimal ornamentation, her hair arranged simply, her hands showing evidence of real work rather than mere decorative accomplishment. At 24, she had discovered a version of herself that could never have existed within the constraints of aristocratic society. As Mrs. Julian Hadley, she managed the practice's administrative operations, assisted with basic patient care, and coordinated charitable medical services for Bath's poor. The work was demanding, frequently exhausting, and more fulfilling than any London ballroom performance had ever been. The morning's patients had included a factory worker with a badly set broken arm that Julian was attempting to correct, a shopkeeper's wife suffering from persistent cough that required careful monitoring, and 3 children from the workhouse whom Genevieve examined for signs of malnutrition and disease. Each case was documented meticulously, treatments recorded, follow-up appointments scheduled. This was medicine as Julian practiced it, not merely treating wealthy invalids' imaginary ailments, but genuinely improving lives through scientific knowledge and compassionate care. Mrs. Patterson's cough is improving significantly with the tincture you prescribed, Genevieve reported, as Julian emerged from the examination room, washing his hands thoroughly in the manner he insisted upon, despite many colleagues' dismissal of such precautions. She's regained 2 pounds this month and says she's sleeping better. Excellent. Julian's smile carried the satisfaction of successful treatment. And the Morrison children? Malnourished, but responding well to the supplemental diet program. I've arranged for them to receive additional meals through the charitable fund. Genevieve closed the ledger, meeting her husband's eyes with shared understanding. These small victories, a cough cured, children properly fed, suffering alleviated, represented the purpose that now defined her days. Julian crossed to where she stood, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I could not manage any of this without you. You know that, don't you? You're not merely assisting, you're essential to everything we accomplish here. The words warmed her more than any aristocratic compliment ever had, because they reflected genuine partnership. Their marriage, now over a year established, had evolved into exactly the companionship Julian had promised during his proposal. They worked side by side during days, discussed medical cases and social reform over dinner, read together in the evenings, and shared a physical intimacy that Genevieve had discovered was profoundly different when grounded in mutual respect and affection. I have correspondence from London, Julian mentioned, retrieving letters from his desk. One from your mother, actually. Genevieve accepted the envelope with mild trepidation. Her relationship with her parents had gradually thawed from initial disappointment to cautious acceptance, but her mother's letters still occasionally carried barbs about squandered opportunities and reduced circumstances. This letter, however, surprised her. Lady Constance wrote with unusual warmth, reporting that she and Lord Edmund would visit Bath in October and hoped to see the medical practice that so occupied their daughter's time. More surprisingly, her mother acknowledged that Genevieve appeared genuinely content in ways I confess I did not anticipate. Poor. The letter concluded with news that Charlotte had given birth to a daughter, that the Ashton marriage seemed stable if not particularly warm, and that London society had moved on to fresh scandals, rendering Genevieve's Westminster humiliation old news. My mother is softening in her old age, Genevieve observed with amusement. She actually sounds curious about our work here rather than mortified by it. People can surprise us, Julian replied diplomatically. He had developed cordial if formal relations with Genevieve's parents, navigating the complex social dynamics with more grace than she had anticipated. And perhaps she's recognizing that titles and estates don't guarantee happiness, while genuine purpose frequently does. A knock at the practice door interrupted their conversation. Genevieve opened it to find an unexpected visitor, Eleanor Thorne, or rather Eleanor Whitmore now, having remarried as Lucian had mentioned during their Hyde Park encounter. She looked prosperous and content, dressed in respectable middle-class fashion, her auburn hair arranged neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Mrs. Whitmore, Genevieve greeted with genuine warmth. The two women had developed an unlikely correspondence over the past year, bonding through their shared experience of Lucian's deceptions. What brings you to Bath? My husband has legal business here, and I hoped we might call on you and Dr. Hadley. Eleanor's smile held residual nervousness, but also determination. I wanted you to meet William properly, and to thank you, actually. Thank me? Genevieve ushered her inside, where Julian greeted their visitor with courteous professionalism. Eleanor settled into a chair, her hands folded in her lap. After Westminster, after everything became public, I felt such shame for the spectacle I'd created. But your subsequent actions, refusing to blame me, focusing your criticism on Lucian's deceptions rather than my interruption, those were noted by people who mattered. And when Thomas Whitmore, my current husband, learned of my circumstances, he was impressed by your character. He said any lady who could respond to such humiliation with dignity and fairness was worth knowing. In an odd way, your gracious response helped lead to my current happiness. Genevieve absorbed this unexpected revelation. She had responded to Eleanor with compassion rather than blame because it had seemed the ethical choice, not anticipating any broader implications. I'm glad you found happiness, Eleanor. Truly. The situation was Lucian's failure, not yours. You were also his victim. As were you, Eleanor acknowledged, but you've transformed that victimhood into something remarkable. I've heard about your medical work, about the charitable initiatives you coordinate. You've built something meaningful from catastrophe's wreckage. They spent a pleasant hour together, Eleanor describing her marriage to Thomas Whitmore, a widowed solicitor with 2 daughters who had welcomed both Eleanor and young William into their family. She produced a miniature portrait of William, a beautiful child with distinctive grey eyes that proclaimed his paternity, but surrounded by a loving family that would raise him without the burden of his father's mistakes. After Eleanor departed, Genevieve stood at the practice window, watching her former rival disappear into Bath's bustling streets. The interconnections fascinated her, how that catastrophic Westminster morning had rippled outward, affecting multiple lives, ultimately leading both her and Eleanor toward better futures than they would have found with Lucian. "You're philosophical this afternoon," Julian observed, joining her at the window. "I'm reflecting on how disaster can be disguised opportunity," she replied. 18 months ago, I stood humiliated before hundreds of witnesses, my carefully planned future in ruins. Today, I'm genuinely happy in ways I couldn't have imagined then. Eleanor found love with a good man who values her. Even Lucian, according to her, is apparently attempting genuine reform, focusing on his estates and his acknowledged son, rather than shallow social climbing. That single moment at the altar, as horrifying as it was, redirected multiple lives toward better trajectories. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Eleanor hadn't interrupted?" Julian asked quietly. Genevieve turned to face her husband, taking his hands in hers. "I would have married Lucian, discovered his deceptions gradually over years, and spent my life trapped in elegant misery, pretending everything was acceptable while dying inside. I would have hosted perfect dinner parties, attended endless social events, produced heir and spare, and never known this purpose, this partnership, this genuine happiness. So no, Julian, I don't wonder. I'm profoundly grateful for every element that led me here, including the public humiliation that made London gossip for months." That evening, as was their custom when schedule permitted, they walked along the River Avon, the setting sun painting Bath's honey-stone buildings in golden light. Other couples promenaded along the riverside paths, working-class families enjoying evening air, elderly invalids taking prescribed exercise, young people courting with varying degrees of subtlety. They encountered, quite unexpectedly, a familiar face. Lucian Ashford stood near the Pulteney Bridge, his attention focused on a young boy playing with a toy boat at the water's edge. William, clearly, looking happy and healthy. At Lucian's side stood an older woman, respectably dressed, whom Genevieve assumed was the child's nurse. Lucian noticed them and straightened, his expression guarded but not hostile. He approached with careful courtesy. "Mrs. Hadley, Dr. Hadley, good evening." "Your Grace," Genevieve replied, noting how much more at ease he appeared than during their previous London encounter. "Your son is beautiful." "He is, isn't he?" Lucian's expression softened as he glanced at William. "Eleanor permits me regular visits, which is far more generous than I deserve. I'm attempting to be the father he needs, though I'm learning it's considerably more demanding than I anticipated." He paused, then continued with evident difficulty. "I owe you both. Well, I've said this before, but seeing you here, clearly content, it bears repeating. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, Mrs. Hadley, and I'm glad you found someone who values you as I failed to do." "We all survived, Your Grace," Genevieve replied with genuine equanimity. "You're building relationship with your son. Eleanor found love with a good man, and I discovered my true calling. Perhaps it all worked out as it was meant to." After they parted, Julian whistled softly. "You're remarkably charitable toward him." "I'm happy," Genevieve explained simply, "genuinely, thoroughly happy. When you're this content with your life, it's easier to forgive those who inadvertently helped you find your path, even if their methods were catastrophic at the time." As twilight deepened and Bath's lamps began to glow, they returned to their modest home above the medical practice. Genevieve prepared a simple dinner, while Julian reviewed medical journals, the domestic routine comfortable and companionable. After eating, they sat together in their small parlor, Genevieve embroidering, while Julian read aloud from a new treatise on infectious disease prevention. The scene was utterly ordinary, completely unglamorous by aristocratic standards, and absolutely perfect. "Do you remember what you said to me at Lady Pemberton's ball?" Genevieve asked during a pause in Julian's reading. "That my catastrophe at Westminster had granted me the freedom to choose?" "I remember," Julian confirmed, setting aside his book to focus entirely on her. "You were absolutely right. I was raised in a golden cage, trained to be decorative and obedient, prepared for a life that would have slowly suffocated everything vital in me." That moment at the altar, when the stranger whispered his revelation and Lucien's face transformed, that was the cage door springing open. It was terrifying and humiliating, but it was also liberation. And I chose this, chose you, chose meaningful work, chose authentic life over gilded performance. And Julian, I would choose it again every single time. He crossed to where she sat, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "I wake every morning grateful that a duke's deception freed you to find me. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you honest," she laughed, "and it makes us both recipients of disguised blessings. We bloom where we're planted, darling, and sometimes it takes catastrophe to plant us in soil where we can actually grow." The Abbey bells rang 9 o'clock, their sound drifting through the open window, along with the evening sounds of Bath, settling into night. Somewhere in London, aristocratic society continued its elaborate performances, its marriages of convenience and strategic alliances. Somewhere in the countryside, Lucian Ashford was learning to be a father to his illegitimate son. Somewhere nearby, Eleanor Whitmore was building a family with a man who valued her beyond her beauty. And here, in modest rooms above a medical practice in working-class Bath, Genevieve Hadley had found what aristocratic elevation could never have provided: purpose, partnership, and the profound satisfaction of living an authentic life on her own chosen terms. The golden cage was gone, replaced by open doors and genuine freedom. She had been raised to be a duchess, but she had chosen instead to become herself. And that choice, born from catastrophe and sealed at an altar that nearly destroyed her, had made all the difference. If this story resonated with you, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic historical tales. Share in the comments which moment affected you most. Was it the catastrophic altar scene, Genevieve's transformation in Bath, or her ultimate choice of purpose over prestige? Your engagement helps these stories reach others who appreciate tales of resilience, redemption, and the courage to choose authentic happiness over society's expectations. Thank you for listening.